Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for March of 2023. I've got 9 recent releases that I spun over the last month that I'm going to talk about today, with time codes listed in the description for each particular album if you would like to jump ahead in the video. I've got a request and some anticipated stuff and some morbid curiosities also thrown in the mix this time. Leave this video a like if you're excited and let's go ahead and dive on in.
I've been one of them, I see it in my friends. The jealousy, they wanna be.
You all know, maybe by this point, I like Slowthai. I've covered his discography up to this point on the listening log, and I liked that he teased on one of the singles leading up to the Selfish a little more of a rock-leaning sound, something that I think that he could have handled oh so gracefully, given he did some pretty good collaborations, in my opinion, with Idols, with a remix of Model Village, and the track that he did with the Gorillaz was really, really good as well. And I think that his voice just kind of suits the genre a little better than some people that are also kind of trying to do the rapper doing rock thing. And I like that he doesn't just keep it into this one realm of like post-punk inspired rock either. While that does code a lot of the album with tracks like Selfish and Fuck It Puppy. And what's funny, I like that he also pivots towards a little bit of a slower guitar-driven groove like on Ugly, or this more throwback groove that isn't necessarily rock, but it's kind of rock adjacent with Sooner. I like that lyrically he is painting this ugly portrait of somebody that has gone and is going through a lot, while also trying to keep your own mask of optimism to push you through to greener pastures. It's no surprise that the album taps into that theme, given that it feels like this album was also kind of a process to pull together for him. While on tracks like Feel Good, he is trying to feel like he's putting on sort of a mask of like, I feel so good, I feel so good. And on Fuck It Puppet, he kind of takes a little bit more of a therapeutic approach to his songwriting. And on the closer, 25%, he sort of gives a good inverse to the feeling of a vice being not drugs, like on Yum, but the feeling of knowing that you are the component of somebody that completes them is a really nice sentiment to send an album that gets this low out on. Because for all of those positive ideas that he sort of channels, or those attempts at positivity he's trying to channel, he gets to some real sadness and some real anger and aggression and self-purging. I already talked about him talking about in confronting his addictions on the opener Yum. He talks about the downfall of a relationship on Never Again. Something that he sort of tries to also spin on Happy, a song where he kind of talks about not putting anything that's going to harm you before yourself. He channels some bleak sadness on the sort of interlude feeling song Falling, and he again goes darker on the penultimate track Tourniquet, which feels like the darkest point before reaching the other side, the dawn, with 25% Club. And again, I like a lot of the sounds here. My biggest complaint, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if it were the case, but I wish that there were more here. There's a deluxe edition of this album, but man, similarly to an album like Cracker Island, man, I just left this wanting just a smidge more. I like what he's channeling on here. I like that he does the rock stuff so well. I like that he melds his version of hip-hop in there as well, because it fits so harmoniously, given his other guitar-driven sampling he'd done on tracks from like his first album. I could hear more of Slowthai doing a post-punk edge album. I think that he does it just pretty darn well. Again, it's an album that I think has its strengths, and I like that when turning his songwriting even more insular, he gets to shine in a variety of facets. I just wanted more. I just wanted more. I still like this thing, though. I still think that it is a very strong, tight album from him, in spite of wanting more. But with that said, I'm still giving this an 8. I still think it's a strong outing. I still think that it's on par with Nothing Great About Britain as Slowthai's best. I still like that album a little more. It kind of feels more like a more well-rounded project as far as like pacing-wise. But I like Ugly a decent fucking amount. I think it's a really strong project from him.
Now you're gone. Well, this life has changed.
Now, while I know this isn't Philip Selway's first album, he actually has a pretty decently sized solo discography. It's my first excursion into a Philip Selway project, Philip being the drummer for Radiohead, for those who don't listen to Radiohead. and I did not know what to expect. I had thought maybe he would do something a little more in line with some of the energy from the most recent Ed O'Brien album, but honestly, he focuses his ideas into an arena that, while kind of makes sense in some aspects, like, yeah, there's some elements of this that are propelling. When he does ramp up the energy, I feel like he does channel a good pocket, obviously, but I think it's interesting that he's actually more of like an acoustically focused musician, to the point that he actually has like strings and gravitas to a lot of this sort of creative energy on this that, like, I feel like at points can feel a bit bland and, I don't want to say like too simple, but like not all that compelling. You know, while I enjoy, honestly, some of the payoffs on here in the vein of like picking up the pieces, I love the cyclical nature of that songwriting, and I like that the song just kind of builds throughout this kinetic energy that I think comes together really well. I also enjoy the piano work on What Keeps You Awake at Night. It's one of the less kinetic moments that I think comes together pretty well. I think that the groove on there is still pretty tight. And again, that sort of use of additional accompaniment sort of works in his favor to create this sort of his spin on what feels like a Miyazaki style song. Like they're not keys, they're like glockenspiels, but again, it's a good percussive element sort of utilized decently in my opinion. I also think the string swell and groove on Make It Go Away is a pretty nice moment. There's some elements on there that feel like very rich with acoustics, and I like the way that they sound. I honestly just think that, like, Philip's songwriting in some regards, like, lyrically can feel kind of, I don't know, non-essential in a way that just kind of makes parts of this feel a little more stock in a way that just, like, I don't know. I expect a little more out of Phil, personally. I know that, like, Tom and Johnny are probably the most amplified voices of Radiohead's creative energy because they're like very high profile. But honestly, I like the other members of Radiohead. I think that, again, Ed has some really good components. Obviously, I think Phil and Colin create a good groove as far as like the foundation of a song. And I think that those components of his songwriting do shine on here still. And I think that there's parts of this I like, and there's parts where the nice production doesn't feel like bland. It feels like to service the acoustic or the more musical tapestry that Phil's making. But I don't know. I didn't like a lot of this as far as like wanting to revisit most of it. I liked components, but as a whole, I just kind of think it was relatively safe. It's not like the worst thing I've heard, but it's definitely not the best. Revisits have actually done it favors for me, because the first couple listens I gave this, I just kept feeling shocked that, like, I don't know, this is what Phil does. But, like, honestly, looking at it from, like, a compositional perspective or, like, a songwriting perspective, there's some cool ideas on here that I think Phil does amicable things with. And I'm giving it a 5. It's not awful, but it's surely not fantastic either. I've said it before with a handful of bands, there's always those legacy acts that I've got enough morbid curiosity that I'll check them out. Because even if I don't like components, I know I'm going to walk away with at least a couple gems that I'm like, you know what? I don't completely regret this transaction. And Periphery are one of those bands. And it's funny, when I made the poll about metal redacteds, Periphery was one of the ones that I was kind of actively working on, just because I think it'd be interesting to pull the Juggernaut albums together. Clearly, I'm not going to be doing it based on how the poll results have been. But here we are. Periphery's back. And while I didn't really like 4, again, it had moments. And I'm always going to have morbid curiosity. So with Djent is not a genre, I was curious to see what they would do with a title like that. And while I don't think it necessarily lives up to maybe the idea of Periphery not writing a Djent album, I do think that there are components of this that actually execute ideas that were kind of explored on 4 a little better, while also having some great songs by the band, partly due to some cool ideas. You know, the opener, Wildfire, is easily, sadly, the best song on the album, but a moment where Periphery kind of adorn an adaptation scene with at least a component of the scene, circa what bands like Rivers of Nile bring more to the forefront. And it's a component that I liked. I liked that about it. I loved the jazzy breakdown. Like, that is easily my favorite Periphery song in a minute. I know I've said last time I'm not a big fan of Spencer's, like, clean vocals, but, like, I think that they're good on that song, and I think that there's components of it on here and in the past where, like, he does bring some good vocal work outside of the growls. This album immediately hits you with, like, a feeling that I kind of felt spinning Shannon Lay's August, actually. Not, like, in a bad way, just in kind of a, oh, okay, this is actually what it is moment, where, like, Wax Wings and Atropos aren't, like, bad songs, but they're very much Periphery doing Periphery. And while I do like both Shannon Lay doing Shannon Lay and Periphery doing Periphery, there are moments where they play the hits better on 5, personally. Everything is Fine's heaviness just fucking stomps. I really love the guitars on that track. And adversely, Spencer's clean vocals on Dying Star I actually enjoy a decent amount, along with the fun instrumentation on that track. Zagreus is another really good, beefier, proggy-ass prog song. I kind of wish components of the 2 closing epics had more going on. Like, especially Drackle Grass. I think that the idea of, like, this just beefy fucking Djent song that goes through these movements of ambience, it just doesn't really utilize Spencer as well as I'd hoped. They just both have moments where they kind of delve into their prog wankeriness that, like, shines in bits of, like, Thanks Nobuo, especially, which has components that feel like a tribute to Nobuo Uematsu, with, like, the melody choice being similar to a Final Fantasy cut and his name in the title. But, like, I enjoy that track, and I think it's a moment where, like, prog-wise, they utilize the length a little better than they do on Drackle Grass. And I guess to pivot it into other components that I don't necessarily like as much, Silhouette I enjoy. I love the synthetic texturing on that song. But it is another moment where I just don't really like Spencer on it. And it's that thing where, like, as much as I enjoy components of this band, sometimes I just don't think it works. And Silhouette's a component. Silhouette's a shining example of that. I know that there's probably people that enjoy that track a lot more than me. I just don't think those elements mesh as well, personally. And like I said, while I enjoy Atropos for its riffage and Wax Wings for being, like, Periphery-ass Periphery songs, they're just kind of tracks that leave me feeling indifferent in the grand scheme of the band's discography. I don't know. I did like components of this more than the last album, and even parts of Select Difficulty. I don't know, I like this. I like parts of this a lot. I'm giving it like a 6 out of 10. I think that it's really, really solid. You know, I think that they've done worse, and again, they've definitely done better, but this is definitely a step in a good direction, in my opinion. Now, I think Miley Cyrus is always an interesting person to check out a new album from, because I never really know what to expect. There are things I like that Miley's done in the past, and there's things that I very much don't. I think that when she knows how to keep a stylistic choice consistent, it can work out well. See her last album, Plastic Hearts. Easily what I would say is her strongest album to date, and a style that I think she harnessed really well. I like that on Endless Summer Vacation she retains that consistency. There's a very laid-back approach to a lot of the grooves here, while keeping the songwriting sharp and autobiographical in pockets in ways that I think she just knows how to tap into very well. I like the lead single, Flowers. Do I think it's a little overplayed? Kind of, but I do like what the song stands for her. I think that it's a good flip on the Bruno Mars track, and I think that as far as cementing the listener in what they're gonna be going throughout this record, it's a good first single. I also like The follow-up track to that, Jaded, I think that it is an even better song. I like the groove of that song as well. And again, that songwriting, just really, really strong. You know, it gives you sort of a not necessarily direct continuation from Flowers, but it feels like sort of further on down the line from the mindset of that track. It's a good sort of chapter 2, as it were. And I like that throughout a lot of the first stretch of this record, it just kind of has this nice pace to it that has both looks at the positive and negative points of a relationship's end. You know, I like that 1,000 Miles is a good, strong collaboration that carries the groove into a little bit more of a lighter atmosphere while having a nice, rich chorus still at its core. You know, I think that the album kind of takes a spottier pivot in its mid-portion, but I don't think that it's necessarily a tremendous setback outside of a couple of instances where there are tracks that I don't necessarily like the execution of for one reason or another. You know, while I like the synthetic usage on Handstand, and I think that the hook is alright, I think that it is a weaker hook on the project. While I think that the ideas that Miley's trying to channel on a track like You could have worked, I think that's a bit too flaccid and kind of a point where the album really crawls to a halt in a way that just kind of, I think is kind of boring. And while I like the intensity, I guess, on Violent Chemistry, I feel like itself kind of feels held back a little bit. You know, I like the flourishing throughout that track, and I think that it's a good track to sort of throttle the listener into the back half of the album after some synthetic ambience that coats that portion of the record. That isn't bad, but I definitely don't think it's as strong as the first portion. It goes into a portion that also feels a little inconsistent. You know, while the atmosphere is well harnessed on here, like on Plastic Hearts, I just don't think the tracks, the songs, are as strong as from that. You know, when Miley shines on here, I think she does incredibly so. I really don't like the vocal production on Wildcard. I think that it is the worst component of that track and really ruins the song, in my opinion. I think Miley does not sound good on that song vocally. And it's wild because there are moments where I feel like that raspy sound that she channeled really well on Plastic Hearts is done so as well on here. But that's just a moment that I feel like really kneecaps the project. And it coming after a collaboration that I don't think is as good, Muddy Waters, which is a shame because that's a moment where, again, the songwriting I think is really strong. I just think the collaboration kind of falls really fucking flat. And I'll be honest, while I also like the closer Wonder Woman a lot, I think that the penultimate track, and I'm not including the demo discussion on here partially because I think it's just kind of bonus track fodder, I think that Island is another just really, really bland song in my opinion. It's there to help enhance the vibes, the endless summer, the summery vibes that this album is trying to channel, but I just don't think is all that exciting of a song, which is kind of upsetting. You know, while it's supposed to be this sort of summer splash album in the vein of like Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer as far as like being a flashy, bright, poppy summer album, this album is not nearly as good as an album like that. Its strengths set it in a meddling range for me personally, but I also think that it's just kind of really held back by some of its bad components. You know, I'm giving it a 6. It's a solid album, and I know I give a lot of pop albums a 6, but that's because, like, this is the archetypal 6 out of 10 pop experience. You know, it's got highs, it's got really good hooks, it's got some decent production, if not being held back by some moments where the production either takes a dip or some of the songwriting just isn't as enticing. You know, I like that it keeps to a thematic core and a stylistic core to enhance those thematics in a sort of subversive way, but I just don't think it's as strong as her last outing personally.
Never taking mine. When I say goodnight, I'm thinking, you get on my...
Normally, I'm not one to say that one should judge a book by its cover, but given not only does the new Macklemore album cover look like this, the first song is a collaboration with famed writer of, like, an incredibly panned project / initial hit, Tones and I. And that song has all the gravitas you would expect from a Macklemore project, maybe, but it isn't it. The energy of the song doesn't evoke that same outright positivity that you may expect from the grandness of a Macklemore project, and instead is replaced with this bitterness that I feel like coats a lot of the record and enhances a lot of the real negative messaging that Macklemore seems to be, or toxic messaging that Macklemore seems to be channeling on Ben. You know, one of the things that I like to say as a joke about Macklemore, or have said for the longest time about Macklemore, is that he feels like hip-hop's weird uncle, and like, with this album, he sort of, I guess in my eyes, sort of tells whose uncle he is, as far as stylistically being an older version of that sort of G-Eazy style rapper circa 2015, 2016, only it's released in 2023. So it makes some parts of this just feel all the more aged and out of touch. You know, tracks like Sorry and Tears and Grime all have these sort of either stage-setting edginess or this bitter, dark spin on a positive idea that just taint this album in this, like, just fuckboy sludge that I just hated combing through whenever I decided to sit down and spin this. You know, Maniac's another example of just embodying that sort of, like, toxic love, fuckboy G-Eazy style that, again, just feels out of touch and aged like some old cheese. You know, while the production on here is fine enough, there's not many beats that I would say I walked away from being like, yeah, that was quality. Obviously, the DJ Premier one, Heroes, was a highlight production-wise because it's a sort of continuing from Buckshot from his last Ryan Lewis collaborative album, and Grime following that up with a pretty amicable DJ Premier-styled old-school boom-bap beat was a nice touch. But a lot of the ambience and guitar styles that coded this feel like the same bland sterility that coded his last solo album without Ryan Lewis, Gemini. I don't know. I really didn't like this album. A lot of the messaging felt very mixed as far as like its tone was considered, and further pushed me in a realm of disliking it more. I don't know if it's the worst thing I've heard this year, because I've already heard some records that I would say I'm not the biggest fan of, but I would put this pretty high up there on my worst of the year list, more than likely by the end of by the time December rolls around. I just don't think that a lot of this is embodying even the guy I had mild nostalgia for when it comes to like okay pop rap from the mid-2010s. Not really bringing much to the table, I would say, is mind-blowing or game-changing either. I'm going to give this like a 2 out of 10. There's a couple ideas I like. It's a 2 out of 10. 757, yeah, I'll never go to heaven. I've been smoking since 11, told the devil he's 11, yeah, Listen, I know some could probably say I take music too seriously or I overanalyze certain projects that just aren't that deep, dude. 10,000 Gecs is an example of an album that actually does an album with that sort of mentality well. You know, I feel like where a lot of people sort of use that as a crutch for lazy production or just piss-poor songwriting, 10,000 Gecs, postmodern-ass, meme-ass style of songwriting, I just think is great. And I think is much better in an album that doesn't need to be taken seriously sort of way than a lot of the stuff that someone could say is just sort of fun pop music. You know, there's some bangers on 10,000 Gecs, man. I got my tooth removed, stuck in my head for a fucking week and a half now. You know, I know some people at work have heard me sing it and are asking themselves, what the fuck is he talking about? 757 sounds like a kaleidoscope from my dreams in 2008. While the Most Wanted Person in the United States sounds like the sort of weird interlude track you would hear on like a Butthole Surfers album if they were trying to poke fun more at the jock jam side of rap rock. You know, the drop into the chorus of Hollywood Baby is everything this 2000s renaissance of nostalgia is clamoring for, man. $1 million goes harder than any of the songs in its style from 1000 Gecs, and one of the things I like about 10,000 Gecs that I haven't really talked about in a broad sense is how it takes ideas from 1000 Gecs and just does them infinitely better. I still like 1000 Gecs. I think that it's a really good album, but 10,000 Gecs is just even more Gecs. And that's honestly all I really needed. And I think that even more Gecs, numerically, like if you look at the chart, if you look at the chart, the medical chart, it does say 10,000 is a higher number than 1,000, which makes 10,000 Gecs a better album. You know, easily. You know, I liked 1,000 Gecs. I like that they just gave us more ska, too. You know, I talked about I got my tooth removed already, but Doritos and Fritos, with what the fuck that's got going on, and Frog on the Floor, just incredible. It goes to show that artistry can also be done like this incredibly well. I'm giving this thing like a fucking 9 out of 10. I really like 10,000 Gecs, man. I knew I was going to like it. Like, I had this on my anticipated albums of the year list, but I didn't think it would be 10,000 times better than the original. Because I'll tell you, I've spun 1,000 Gecs a handful of times post my review. I like what I like from it, but I will probably hold on to all of this a lot more than I did 1,000 Gecs. I wasn't very nice to Mikazuki Bigwave's last project that I checked out because I just didn't really like it. I thought it was a very carbon copy version of what I enjoyed that they'd done in the past, and honestly, it turned me off of their stuff for a little bit, but curiosity struck me. I checked out Escape, and while it does have components that still feel very much like Metropolis in pockets, I don't think Love Decoy was a good first song because it's a big showcasing of that. Again, the build-ups kind of feel formulaic in my opinion. You know, while the chopped sample on Gonna Make You Mine helps with that, it's just another track of the same vein in my opinion. And Capsule 23 is another moment like that, but those are all kind of moments that feel lesser on this in comparison to especially Metropolis. Because, I mean, I honestly like pockets if there's a decent amount and feel like it's a nice sort of readaptation of what I liked prior to this. / like in dance music in general. You know, Stay Alive is a moment that sort of interpolates that formula into a more interesting realm with the rattling claps and the beat underneath that sort of carries the groove in a nice direction. You know, once Discotheque finds its pocket, it's just like cruising through the sunset, man. It's a moment that just the song builds to incredibly well and has, again, familiarities amidst the Mikazuki Bigwave catalog that feel fresh in this instance, you know? Sparkle keeps dancing with the listener in a way that pulls and pushes them closer in a way that I really enjoy the dynamic of. Which is an element that the album tries to toy with in some ways that I just don't think work as well, and leave the album feeling a bit empty in pockets. Like, Innocent, I think it's interesting to create a song almost exclusively with a low-pass filter, but it just was not it, man. And tracks like Angel Heart try to do a similar thing that just leave the song buried for way too long, in my opinion. And the length. I gotta get to the length. One of the things I appreciated about Mikazuki Bigwave was that their projects were a little more contained. There were nice pockets of energy to sort of carry me through a sort of anything. You know, it was nice, energetic music that, while components of it felt a little formulaic, had some fun variations on that to make it sort of a nice, engaging listen. But the problems I have bog this record down from the components I do like. You know, I enjoy the switch-ups that this does and the fun, stuttering production that I think lends this to a different, pivoting towards a different direction that I hope that Mikazuki Bigwave kind of explores more. But I don't know. This thing felt like an experiment, a hodgepodge, and ways to branch out that kind of go too far off the deep end, in my opinion. It's not the worst thing I've heard, and I do appreciate components of this far more than their last outing, but I don't think that I would ever say that I want to throw this collective thing on from start to finish quite as often as I would say Sentimental and the like. But I'm giving this a 5. It's not, like, my least favorite thing from this outfit, but I do think that it is a pivot that tried to spread itself a little too thin. You guys know I was excited for Scaring the Hose. You guys know I like Peggy. You guys know I like Danny Brown. I like both of their blends of experimentation they've done amidst their own discographies. And even though this feels maybe like past the point of Danny dipping back into these realms of experimentation post, you know what I'm saying? But like, Peggy did a beat on there. And the two of them, I mean, I feel like Atrocity Exhibition's like a good example of like Danny's ability to pull together some oddball ideas. And I like that on Scaring the Hose, what their collaboration or what they're coming together sees is just a ramp up of those ideas to a 10, to a point that people are bringing up like criticisms that I could see somebody bringing up on a record like this with somebody as high profile as Danny Brown. But like for people that like know Peggy and knows how he makes music, it absolutely makes sense. You know, a lot of the mixing, a lot of the vocal mixing being the way it is, a lot of the way that the use of like delays and stuff feels very Peggy, and it feels like a great place for him to sort of have a showcasing with maybe a potentially different audience. You know, I like a lot of the beats on here. You know, I thought that Lean Beef Patty's beat was wild and a great sort of first appetizer of things, but like the sample choices and the ways that they crop up throughout this kind of were awesome to see, honestly, and it feels like sort of similarly to other, you know, Peggy stuff, a good just sort of deep dive for people who like great sample choices. You know, when the Khalees sample popped up on Fentanyl Tester, fucking threw me through a loop the first time. I think the horn stuff on Perfect is really cool. I love the sampling on Orange Juice Jones as well. There's a cool like melting pot of ideas that just work, and I think that create a good backdrop for Peggy to bring his own brand of bars. You know, I mean, he starts this thing off on Lean Beef Patty by giving a middle finger to Elon Musk. Tendencies to be really loyal to those around him and stuff like that as well. On Run the Jewels. You know, I mean, he just goes the fuck off on Garbage Pail Kids. He fucking goes off on Fentanyl Tester with the rattling kicks that just pummel the listener with a whirlwind, like a jab flurry. Peggy's doing a lot of great things on here. And Danny Brown, you can tell in pockets he's going through something, and following his tweets he's made post this with in regard to his own solo stuff that's after this, was supposed to drop after this later this year, being pushed back. He's just going through something. He's going through his own recovery, you know, and while you can tell he's having a great time on here, you know, I really love him on Shut Your Bitch Ass Up, talking about how people shouldn't have preconceived notions on what he should do. You know, he knows his brand, he knows what he's doing. Like I said, for Peggy on Ho, Danny also does his thing. He gets, honestly, that classic Danny rowdiness on a handful of this. On there, on Step a Pig, on Scaring the Hose. Obviously on Fentanyl Tester, he goes off a bit. And I like him on here. I think that, you guys know I like Danny's ability to fit a lot of beats, and I think that his ability to still strike a balance of like that less extravagant, absurd, off-kilter flow on, you know what I'm saying, in with this sort of whirlwind style of production. But I like that he also gets to just go off again, you know, in ways that were very much pulled back on, you know what I'm saying. As a fan of Danny since Triple X, I like Danny doing this again, you know, and I think that Peggy was, again, a perfect fit for that. You know, having a track on here, Name Run the Jewels, kind of feels apropos, but also a lot of the track listing on here just reads like a Peggy project co-done by Danny. It's just a perfect recipe for success in my book, and I really like this thing. If anything, it's a shame that they seemingly have gotten rid of the Volume 1 in hopes of more, at least to this caliber, because I love this. And I hope Peggy and Danny sort of go from this into continuing to make great stuff, obviously. But this is great. This is so fucking good. It's getting like a 9. I love this thing a lot. I think that it's incredible. I understand that a lot of people have, or there's some people that have problems with components of this, but I'm eating this the fuck up. Like, I'm not gonna lie, the Kingdom Hearts track feels like a modern Meth vs. Chef. Not only because the beat just goes in a way that reminds me of that, and it has this nice balance of, like, smoothness and abrasiveness that I think is a night. Like the vocal sample with that chopped drums just hits. And then like the end of Peggy's verse ending with like the KO. Fantastic moment. There's a lot of good moments on here that I think showcase I just think there's a lot of good moments on here that are just kick ass. Brady Matteson, friend of the channel, longtime supporter, and Chicagoan synth lover, dropped a new solo album, Every Dream in Your Head, that he asked me to talk about on here. I liked his last project, Rubine, that I talked about on here. He also was in a collaborative piece, Care Center, that I also liked what I'd spun of that. And this new one is another solid batch of some ambient-driven tracks that I feel like cement the listener in a good, uneased sort of mindset, you know, or in a good, uneased sort of landscape to sort of listen to, you know. There's this core of oscillation that coats a lot of the key moments of vibrancy amidst this track listing that I think kind of carry the listener throughout that sort of bleak feeling, almost dystopian sounding soundscape. You know, the opener, Wave Pool, has that oscillation from the beginning with these bursts of sharp synth stings to sort of ramp up the discomfort within the listener that I think is pretty effective at doing so. I think it's a good opener that leads really well into Grief and Cycles, a track that further cements that cyclical approach to songwriting with the synth sort of weaving in this riff that I think is really nice. I think it's a nice riff that has this ambience coded throughout to sort of create a stage. And I like that tracks like the Slow Cancellation of the Future carry that throughout the back half of the record, where while the rest of the album does its best to sort of give you these different flavors of ambience amidst that to further enhance the stage that's being set, as it were. You know, I feel like, and in some instances, I feel like it pays off pretty well. Like on the track with Broken Limbs, which just has this slow burn build-up that gets intense the longer that the track goes on. And I like the intensity that the track builds to. I love the harsh dissonance and some of the synth usage and some of the sounds. I think it sounds really, really dense and by the end of it, and I like what it builds to a lot. And I think it lets the almost hollow sounding ambience with the small pulse and the closer, If You Recover Tell Me, close the record out in splendor. My biggest issue with the project, at least as far as like the one soul detractor for me, comes in the tracks Brainstem and Awash in Sweetness, two tracks that definitely play more to the minimal side of ambient music, and I like the sounds there. I especially like the softness and the reverb in Awash and Sweetness, but I personally think Brainstem is just kind of a song where the minimalism feels less well utilized. It's a track where it feels like the least amount goes on as far as like texturing and stuff like that, and while I feel like that may have been the point of the song because it's supposed to be maybe cerebral, it's called Brainstem, I just don't think it hit the mark for me personally. I do like a lot of this though, and I still think this is a solid batch of nice ambient driven tracks that I think that if you enjoy some nice sonic texturing with some synths, you should throw some of this on. You know, again, Wave Pool, I would argue, is probably my favorite song I've heard Brady pull together, and I like some of the ideas he's cooking with on here. I hope to see it sort of pay off or flourish out into more other avenues in the future. But this is alright. I'd give it like a solid 7, you know, depending on how much this sticks with me. Maybe a 6, but like I think that, again, Wave Pool is a really strong song, and I think that the build-up, again, I love the noise that you get to on this, man, for sure. It left me wanting a little bit more, but the package that you gave me and the doses of ideas you had in the pot were pretty solid, you know? Some strong stuff here, man. Caroline Rose, indie singer-songwriter that is a very talented bag of surprises. On my jumping on point to her loner, it was already a sonic pivot into more indie/indie pop focused territories that I think she stuck the landing on magnificently, which saw a hard pivot into these more lo-fi, reverb-soaked, synth-coded atmospheres on the follow-up to that Superstar, which I think its lyrical palette did a really good job at putting you throughout a conceptual POV. And on The Art of Forgetting, we see her pivot once more keeping the subtle ambience from Superstar, but putting it into a bit more of a cleaner / grander scope in some instances that seemingly see her adding on more layers of sincerity and stripping back the veil of sarcasm that still coated some of her songwriting into a project that is equal parts sad and empowering. And I think that Caroline harnesses that grandiosity with all of the swagger and character that I would expect her to. I really appreciate The Art of Forgiving for going a little bit bolder, yet not sacrificing what I liked about Caroline's songwriting to begin with. And while the slow burn ambient build within the opener Love, Lover, Friend definitely sonically showcases that pivot, even lyrically, it has that same sort of self-awareness and strength in the songwriting that I think Caroline just harnessed as well. And it further delves into the more sincerity immediately after that in a way that I think is handled masterfully. I like that Rebirth continues the ambience from the opener before finally pushing the listener into a groove that it carries for a decent amount of the first stretch. And I like that after the lyrical imagery painted in some of the beginning moments of the first couple of tracks, it gets into the nitty-gritty and really goes into more the purpose of the album in a therapeutic sense, with Caroline getting over a breakup and a really important one to her. You know, it was a relationship that meant a lot to her in spite of it falling apart. You know, you have this planting and payoff moment in Miami into Tell Me What You Want. You get to see Caroline's headspace throughout the process of getting past this. And I like that it leads to a nice resolve by the end of it, lyrically as well, throughout the tracks Love for Myself through to the end, because it reads much like other albums in the vein of like Kendrick's latest, A Therapy Session. You know, this album feels like it's purging through some own internal struggles. You know, there's feelings of grief and loss throughout a lot of this that I think Caroline handles really well. You know, those themes further cemented and enhanced with the interlude tracks Better Than Gold, Cornbread, and Florida Room, where these voicemails, I'm assuming from Caroline's mother, crop out throughout, with these beautifully done instrumental passages beneath them, just show this, I don't know, problems that she's going through, you know. And while some of that comes to light in her own sarcastic sort of way, with the bangers like Everywhere I Go I Bring the Pain, or internalized potential self-conflict with Stockholm Syndrome, I think that Caroline really runs a good songwriting gambit on here. And while I praised a lot of her songwriting for either feeling like a nice sort of piss take on some sincere ideals, or conceptualizing maybe her own trajectory in a sort of dissected sense, I appreciate this for really getting to the nitty-gritty of Caroline's own personal problems, while continuing to showcase her tenacity for harnessing a new sound incredibly well. Sure, I think some of the sequencing on here is a little bit sloppier than on her last couple of albums that I enjoyed, but this is still a hell of a really good release that I think showcases the importance of, again, music as therapy, something that I've talked about a lot, something that I myself have personally done when it comes to songwriting, and I think that Caroline really helps herself get through her own problems in her own proverbial ways on here. There's another banger from her. I think she just doesn't miss. I think she's an incredible songwriter that has a good ear for good songs. I mean, like I said, there's bangers on here, like Everywhere I Go I Bring the Pain, but I also think Jill Says and Where Do I Go From Here and Love Song for Myself see her even coming across that pain on the other side with some good feelings. You know, Love Song for Myself also has a really good groove at its core that, like, sticks out amidst a lot of the ambience and acoustic-driven stuff that coats this thing. You know, I enjoy this thing a lot. I think it's a really good album that I think that if you're a fan of really good singer-songwriter stuff, don't sleep on this. If you haven't checked out Caroline Rose, you're still sleeping on a really good artist here, guys. I think this is getting an 8 out of 10. Still a really good release from her, and I think that it's still one of the strongest albums I've heard this year thus far. And that's what I spun. That's what I listened to over the last month. Have you heard any of these albums? Do you like any of them? Let me know your thoughts on them and any albums you'd like for me to check out from this year in the comments down below. If you did like this particular video, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I'm going through at the time. Either way, I'm going to go. Thank you for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations. And I'll see you another day!